The first thing Samuel saw wasn't the girl. It was the sign wood split nailed to the crook of an old cottonwood, its letters burned in crude with a branding iron. White man buries the innocent. And beneath it, something moved. Not the wind, a body swaying. Slow, like a thought you can't shake. She wasn't dead. Not yet. She hung from her arms, wrists tied with coarse rope, elbows pulled behind her in a way shoulders weren't meant to bend. Her toes grazed the dust, leaving smudged half-moons in the dirt with every sway. Her head lolled forward, hair stuck to her cheek with dried sweat and blood. Not enough blood to mean death, just enough to mean cruelty. One eye opened just a slit. Apache. Maybe 14, maybe less. Maybe the age of someone Samuel once knew, back when his wife bled out in childbirth under the same color sky. The cottonwood's leaves rattled like coins above her, silver green and rusted at the edges like they were dying too. She wasn't gagged. They wanted her to scream, but there was no voice left. Beside her, tied with twine to a low branch, a wind chime tinkled faintly, bones and metal scraps threaded together like children's jewelry. It clinked softly in the still desert air, a lullaby made for ghosts. Samuel sat frozen on his horse, not because he didn't care, but because this wasn't the first time he'd seen a warning strung up with flesh. The girl lifted her head. Barely. Their eyes met. No pleading. Just that hollow animal knowing you either help me now, or I die as a message. Samuel dismounted, slowly. His boot hit the ground like a gavel. He walked forward, one step at a time, scanning for snares, for watchers, for rifles peering behind brush. Nothing. Whoever did this was long gone, or watching from a place only cowards watch from far enough not to see the blood crusting around a child's lips. She didn't flinch as he drew near, didn't cry, but when he reached up and touched the rope around her wrists, her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from the memory of being touched without pain. The knot was tight, deliberately reversed, made to shred skin when untied. Samuel didn't speak, didn't curse, just pulled his knife and began sawing through it slow. Careful. The blade slipped once, slicing his thumb. Blood dripped onto her shoulder. She didn't even blink. One rope gave, then another. She dropped hard into his arms and her knees buckled. He caught her. The moment his arms wrapped around her tiny frame, she convulsed a shiver so violent it almost threw her from him. But he didn't let go. Her head rested against his chest now, breath shallow. But there, he smelled the desert in her hair-hot dust, rusted iron, and something else. Ashes. Above them. The sign creaked. White man buries the innocent, each word carved with rage, too focused to be drunk, too deliberate to be dismissed. Samuel stared at it, not with offense, but with something deeper. Maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe it was just a truth told wrong. Then he turned, carried her toward his horse. No saddle. He'd walk. The girl didn't speak, but as her head lolled against his shoulder, he felt it faint pressure, her fingers curling into his shirt, like she wasn't asking, just acknowledging. They passed the wind chime made of bone. It clinked once. Samuel stopped. He pulled it down and tucked it into his saddlebag. Not as a keepsake, but as proof. A mile out, the sky turned violet, the kind of color that only comes when something is ending or about to begin. Samuel didn't look back, but in his chest, something shifted. Not rage, not pity, just the heavy hum of a man who's carried silence too long. And now it had a name. Not hers. He didn't know it yet. But the bird bones clinked in his bag, and in their rhythm he heard something strange. Not mourning, not fear, but accusation. And he knew this wasn't just about saving a girl, when it was about digging up a truth they had all agreed to bury. As they reached the edge of the canyon trail, the girl lets out a sound, not a word, just a faint gasp, as her shoulder brushes the saddle horn. Samuel pauses, tightens his grip, and whispers, for the first time in years to anyone, "You're all right now." The words hang in the dusk, Not a promise, but a decision. The trail back was long and too quiet, the kind of quiet that bruises the soul. Not even the coyotes sang that night. Samuel walked beside the horse, reins slack in his hand. The girl, still nameless, lay draped across the saddle blanket, her thin frame rising with each breath, as if each one was borrowed from something bigger than her. A wind picked up from the east, dry and salted, stirring the rope fibers still wrapped around her wrist. He glanced at it, didn't remove it, not yet. Not. Sometimes you leave a wound visible so the world knows it happened. His cabin stood alone at the basin of the hills, half buried in rock and shadow. No fence, no gate, no wife waiting with stew or questions. Just a porch post he carved years ago with initials he no longer traced. As he approached the door, he didn't call out, didn't announce himself. No one would answer. He opened the door, stepped inside, and lit the oil lamp with a flint strike that snapped the dark. Dust lifted from corners. The place smelled of pine smoke and old whiskey. He laid her on the bed without hesitation, boots still on, hands gently placed at her sides. She murmured something too slurred to catch. Then nothing. Samuel stood for a long moment, looking down at her the way a man looks at something he's afraid to fix. Not because he can't, but because fixing it means it was broken to begin with. He sat at the edge of the bed, reached for his canteen and unscrewed the lid with fingers still trembling from the knot he'd cut. Poured a trickle onto a rag. He touched it to her lip. She flinched. He waited, then tried again. This time, her lips parted just enough to drink. The rag came away stained pink, not from blood, but from the rawness of thirst unmet for too long. He worked slowly, wiping her brow, pressing water to her neck, cutting away the rope still wrapped around her right wrist. The knot had dug deep, skin torn, already festering. He didn't grimace, just reached for the tin of bear grease on his shelf and spread it gently over the wound. She didn't cry, didn't even wince. Her silence was worse than a scream. He found a spare shirt and tore it into strips, binding her wrist like he remembered the army doctors used to do. Clean, precise, but not detached. His hand lingered a moment too long, and when he noticed, he stood, stepped away, and poured himself a glass of water. Not whiskey, not tonight. Outside, the coyotes finally started, a low, drawn-out howl that sounded too much like a question. Samuel didn't answer. He moved to the corner, laid down a second blanket, and placed his rifle within reach. He wouldn't sleep, but he'd rest his body beside hers, like a silent promise. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across her face, and for the first time, he noticed the paint, not blood. Red ochre streaked across her cheek, in shapes not meant for white men to understand. Marks of a ceremony. A curse, no. A memory. He reached for a tin bowl, filled it with warm water, and dipped a cloth again. He didn't wipe the paint off, just held the cloth, waiting. Let her decide. Her eyes opened. Just a sliver. Then she turned her face into the pillow, and the cloth stayed clean. So he placed it at the bed's edge, close enough for her to reach, far enough not to intrude. That was how the night passed. Not with questions, not with prayers, just with breath and silence. When dawn broke, soft and gold through the slats, Samuel sat on the porch, carving a piece of cedar. Not anything specific, just whittling the edge off his nerves. Sighed. The girl stirred. He didn't go to her. But when he heard the floor creak and her bare feet touch the plank wood, he didn't move either. Then, a sound. Not words. A knock. From the inside. She had closed the door behind her, and now asked politely, deliberately, to be allowed out. Samuel stood, heart loud in his ribs. He opened the door. She stood with the blanket wrapped around her like a shawl, face pale, eyes steady. And in her hand, she held the cloth. Wet. She had washed her own face. Her cheeks were clean now, but her eyes held the same red, not painted. Lived. Samuel held the door open. She stepped past him into the morning air, stopped, looked out at the ridge where the cottonwoods leaned, and whispered something in Apache, a word he didn't know. But the way she said it, like letting go of a thorn lodged deep in the heart. Then she sat down on the steps, and he sat beside her. Nothing else needed, just breath and sunrise and shared silence. The third day came slow, soft like smoke in a pine grove. And when it did, she still hadn't spoken a word, but she hadn't run either. Samuel didn't press, didn't ask her name, didn't ask what had been done, because some things lose their truth when forced into English. Instead, he spoke to her in movements. He'd set the basin near the fire, heat the water, test it on his wrist, lay out a clean cloth beside a tin of tallow, and turn his back. Every day. She'd wash her own wounds. Every day. He'd leave the door open. She didn't leave. That morning, he set a peach on the table. Soft, yellow, and bruised at the stem. She stared at it for a long while, then picked it up, held it with two hands like something sacred, and ate it slowly, skin and all. When she finished, she licked the juice from her wrist, then looked up at him. Not with thanks, but with permission, as if saying, "You may give me food, but not pity." He nodded once. That was the deal. By noon, she was outside, kneeling by the horse trough, hands submerged in the cool water. She stared into it, not at her reflection, but through it, as if searching for something buried deep below. A name. A voice. Samuel watched from the porch, whittling again. This time, the cedar was taking shape, a bird, wings half-folded, neck bent as if looking back. She noticed, stood, walked to him without hesitation, and pointed at the bird, then at herself. He blinked. She shook her head, then pointed again at the carving, then to the air. "Not you," he muttered. "The bird." She held up 3 fingers and then traced a curve in the air. A wing. She wanted to paint. He hesitated and sighed. He had a box of old tools, paints left from his wife, used once to decorate the kitchen. He fetched it, set it beside her. She opened the lid and touched each color like she was remembering something, then took the yellow, the only yellow. With her finger, she dragged a single line across the cabin wall, then another, then curved both ends inward, the beginnings of wings, a bird, rough but distinct, painted in yellow ochre, right above the windowsill. It wasn't flying, it was sleeping, wings folded tight to its body. Samuel stood behind her, arms crossed. "You've painted that before," he said softly. She didn't respond, but her finger paused in midair, then lowered. Later that evening, she sat by the fire, legs crossed, eyes on the flames. Samuel brought her a tin of broth rabbit, thinned with creek water and herbs, set it down without a word. She took it, drank slow, then looked at him. Really looked, not like a stray looks at a hand, but like a ghost trying to remember being alive. "Samuel," he said finally, and pointed at his chest, then waited. She blinked, pointed to herself, then tapped her collarbone. Twice. No sound. He nodded, didn't ask again. Later that night, when the fire was low, he heard her cry for the first time, not loud, just soft, broken gasps behind the door. He didn't go in, didn't knock, but he stayed near the fire and left a mug of hot water at her door. The next morning, the mug was empty, and on the cabin wall, beside the first yellow bird, was a second. This one smaller, facing the first, as if waiting for it to wake up. The next morning, before the sun reached the treetops, Samuel found her kneeling outside with a paint-soaked rag. She wasn't painting this time. She was scrubbing something furiously, the wooden sign he had pulled from the cottonwood tree. "White man buries the innocent." She was trying to erase it, but the letters wouldn't come off. He stepped beside her. She didn't stop. He didn't speak. Then she looked up, eyes burning, and whispered one word. The first he'd ever heard from her. They lied. The brush shook in her hand, but she kept painting. 3 strokes. Pause. 2 more. Breathe. The wall now held a third bird, larger, head tilted skyward, its wings still closed. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her arm. Her bandaged wrist was stiff scab deep around the bone. The joints no longer bent right, but that didn't stop her. Every day now, she painted, not for beauty, not for meaning, but survival. Symbols meant something her mouth couldn't carry. The birds were her language. Each one whispered things words couldn't hold. Samuel watched, arms crossed at the cabin door. He didn't interrupt, just as she hadn't asked permission. This was hers. By the sixth bird, something in him cracked, not because of the color, not because of the way they formed a silent flock along the cedar wall, but because none of them were flying. Every bird had wings, but none were open. That night, as she scraped paint into the tin lid with the back of a knife, she finally spoke. Only 2 words. He lied. Samuel looked up from his chair, the fire snapping behind him. He waited. She tapped her chest, then touched the red paint left on her thigh. Samuel didn't understand. She stared at the wall, at the 6th bird, then slowly. She raised her hand and made a motion with 2 fingers. A slit. Across the throat, the fire flickered. Samuel sat forward. Who, he asked. No answer. But she touched her own arm where the ropes had been, then mimed holding something, digging, burying. His breath caught. They made you dig. She didn't nod, didn't blink. But that silence said enough. Samuel leaned forward, hands laced together. How many? She looked to the birds. 6. No. 7. There was a 7th space on the wall, still blank. A ghost waiting for form. He felt the bile rise in his throat. Not from sickness, from truth. She rose, walked outside. He followed. Moonlight spilled across the hard-packed earth. She knelt in the dust with a stick and scratched symbols he couldn't read, then drew a circle. And inside it a bird with no wings, not folded, not broken, just gone. She looked up at him then, eyes full of something darker than grief. Wasn't supposed to live, she whispered, then stood. He reached for her shoulder. She didn't pull away, didn't lean in, but she stayed. A long minute passed. Then she walked to the cabin, climbed the steps, and entered. Samuel remained outside, staring at the dirt. The wind had kicked up, but not a single star blinked. The next morning, he saddled the horse, tied bedrolls, packed jerky and flint. She stood in the doorway. You don't have to come, he said. She looked at him, then at the birds on the wall, then stepped forward. No shoes, just bare feet on cracked earth. She pointed east. He nodded. They rode slow. By nightfall, they reached the cottonwood again. The wind chime still hung from the branch, tangled with dry feathers and rusted copper. He hadn't burned it, hadn't buried it. He untied it now, laid it in her hands. She didn't flinch. She buried it. Right there at the base of the tree, no prayer, just silence. Then, from her satchel, she pulled a bit of yellow powder-crushed petals mixed with ash and spread it across the grave. Samuel didn't ask where she got it. He just watched. The moonlight caught her face, and in that light, she no longer looked like a girl. She looked like memory itself. Before they turned to leave, she took one last thing from her satchel. A small wooden carving rough, childlike. It was the first bird Samuel had whittled. She had kept it. She buried it too, then looked at him, eyes wet, but this time, not from pain, from goodbye. She wasn't painting ghosts anymore. She was letting them rest. Back at the cabin, spring had begun to flirt with the land. The grass turned stubbornly green in patches, and the breeze carried warmth that hadn't been there in months. So did she. Her shoulders relaxed now. Her hair, no longer matted with blood and dust, fell freely down her back, and when she painted the 8th bird, it finally had wings. Open, extended wide like a scream turned into a hymn. Samuel stood behind her as she finished the last stroke, said nothing. But his chest ached. Not with pity, with something slower, heavier, older. Desire not as flesh, but as recognition. To see someone come back to life right in front of you and feel honored to witness it. That morning, she sat with him on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee, one untouched. She stared at the trees, humming something low, not a song, not just a sound she'd carried from wherever she'd come from. He didn't ask what it meant. Instead, he said, "You ever want to, stay?" She didn't answer with words, just reached out and touched his hand, not soft, not timid, just placed her hand on top of his and left it there. A second passed, then 2. Then she pulled away and walked inside. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the coals, red-orange, like the paint that once streaked her cheek. He heard the floor creak, didn't turn, felt her step behind him, then beside him. She didn't speak. She just leaned her head on his shoulder. No weight, no pressure, just presence. And he didn't move, because this was love, the kind that never asks, never demands, just stays. The next day, she painted again. This time, not birds, but hands. 2 of them, side by side, one darker, one lighter, both reaching, not touching, but close. He saw it that evening. Didn't comment, just brought her the tin bowl of water as he always did. She took it, and this time she washed his hands, wiped the dirt and calluses with quiet grace, and when she dried them with cloth, she held them in hers for a long moment, then pressed her forehead to his palm. He felt tears, not hers, his. He didn't even know they'd come, but they did. And when she looked up at him, she whispered, "Birds can't love cages, even kind ones." He nodded. "I ain't a cage." "No," she said softly. "You're a porch, a place to land." Then she kissed his hand, not the lips, not the chest, the hand that untied her. The moon hung heavy that night, and the world felt slower, like it was holding its breath. He couldn't sleep. She couldn't either. They sat together by the wall under the painted birds and watched the fire die down. She reached out, took his fingers, laced them through hers, and leaned her head against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her, not as claim, as shelter, and when she finally slept there, he stayed awake for hours, staring at the yellow bird above them. Its wings were open now, but it still wasn't flying. The next morning, Samuel woke to the sound of boots. Too many for the trail, too heavy for peace. He rose slowly, reached for his rifle, opened the door, and there on the ridge stood 3 men on horseback, dusty hats, hard eyes, and behind them, a 4th man dismounted. He wore a deputy's badge, spat tobacco into the dirt, and called out, "She don't belong here. Reeve, you know that." Inside the cabin, she rose quietly, pulled her shawl around her, but didn't cry, didn't shake. She just looked at the painted birds on the wall and whispered, "Let's see if they can fly." The deputy's voice rang through the canyon like a hammer hitting bone. "She's wanted in 3 counties, he called out. "She ran from custody. There's a bounty." He spat again, not out of need, out of habit. Samuel stepped forward onto the porch, rifle resting across his arms like a judgment not yet spoken. Behind him, the girl stood in the shadow of the doorframe, her shawl draped over one shoulder, face calm, but not still. A wind stirred from the south, not the kind that cools, the kind that smells like heat and dust and blood about to dry. "I ain't handing her over," Samuel said. Quiet, final. One of the men chuckled from his saddle. The deputy didn't. "Then I reckon you're choosing sides." Samuel lowered the rifle just a fraction. "I chose my side the day I cut her down." The girl stepped forward, not behind Samuel, beside him. The shawl slipped, revealing the old bruises on her wrist and the new scar on her forearm, still pink with memory. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was a testimony. The deputy looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt. Recognition. He knew. He'd seen the sign too. Maybe he was the one who nailed it. Or maybe he just rode with the men who had. Didn't matter. He motioned to the others. Search the place. Take her if she runs. Samuel cocked the rifle. You step on this porch, he said. You best be ready to die for it. The horses shuffled. One man muttered something too soft to catch. Then the girl moved. She stepped down, past Samuel, walked into the sun. The men tensed, but she didn't run. She walked to the edge of the trail slow, barefoot, the way people walk through sacred places. She reached into her satchel, pulled out something small, held it high. The yellow carving. The bird. The one Samuel had whittled months ago. The one she buried beneath the cottonwood tree. But this was a second one. She hadn't buried the real one. She had carved a new one. This one had wings extended. It wasn't sleeping anymore. She held it high, then smashed it on a rock. The snap echoed like a gunshot. Every man flinched. Then she picked up the broken pieces and scattered them in the wind. A ritual, a declaration. I won't run, she said. Her voice was stronger than it had ever been. But I won't go back. She turned to Samuel, her eyes burned. Not with fear, but love so fierce it hurt to look at. Then she smiled. It was small, frail, but real. And that was what broke him. Samuel raised the rifle, stepped down beside her, and faced the four men. You'll take her, he said, over my dead body. The deputy narrowed his eyes. Don't tempt it. Reeve. Samuel took one step forward, then another. You think I'm scared of you? He pointed at the badge. I've buried better men than you in dirt that couldn't hold their names. A pause, then the sound of hoofbeats. Fast. From the North Trail, another rider. Dust trailing behind him like smoke from a fire. He rode hard, wore no uniform. When he reached the standoff, he dismounted and pulled a folded paper from his coat. Governor's order, he shouted, charges dropped. Bounty rescinded. The deputy cursed, snatched the paper, read it once, then twice, then crumpled it. This ain't over, he hissed. No, Samuel replied, but it's over for today. The deputy turned his horse. The other men followed. The dust cleared slow. When they were gone, Samuel turned to her. You all right? She didn't answer, just held out her hand, and he took it, not as savior, not as protector, as equal. That night she painted again. The wall now held 9 birds, the 9th golden, broken at one wing, but flying anyway. She stood in the doorway, barefoot, watching the stars blink open like old wounds healing. Then she whispered, They tried to break me again. Samuel, standing behind her, didn't speak, just reached up and tied a small chime above the porch, not made of bone this time. Wood, carved by her hands. It clinked softly in the breeze, and for the first time in months, she didn't flinch. The sun fell slow that evening like it was reluctant to leave her face. She stood by the cabin wall, brush in hand, staring at the blank space above the 9 birds she had painted over the months. Her fingers trembled, but not from pain, from decision. Samuel watched from the porch, arms resting on his knees, eyes steady. He didn't speak, didn't ask. He knew this moment wasn't his. It belonged to her. She dipped the brush into the last of the yellow paint, now mixed with ash and dirt and something else, something older, something sacred. And then, with 3 deliberate strokes, she painted a final bird. This one, asleep, wings tucked, beak nestled into feather, its eye closed, at peace. Above it, she dipped the brush in black and wrote, in English, she lives here now. No one told her those words. No one taught her how to write them. But they came out as if she'd always known how, as if she'd rehearsed them in her dreams. Samuel rose slowly, walked to stand behind her. He looked at the final image, the 10th bird, and he knew. She wasn't fleeing anymore. She wasn't surviving. She was living. They built the porch wider that week, added a second chair. hung a wind chime made of polished wood and feathers, carved from scraps of the broken bird she had shattered when they came for her. Each time it moved in the breeze, it didn't wail. It whispered. Peace, not silence born of fear but of choice. She no longer painted on the wall. Instead, she carved into the cedar posts, into the doorframe, into her own space. Marks of belonging, not as a guest, as a resident, as herself. Sometimes they spoke. Most days they didn't need to. She'd tend the garden near the well. He'd split logs. Their paths would cross in the quiet. And sometimes they'd touch hands, not grasping, just touching, as if to say, I'm still here. One evening, thunderclouds rolled in from the west, big swollen things, the kind that bring flash floods and fever dreams. She stood outside, arms open, welcoming the storm. When the rain came, she laughed, not smiled, laughed, head tilted back, face soaked, bare feet in the mud. Samuel stood at the door watching her, like a man seeing spring for the first time after 50 winters. She danced, not with grace but with defiance, and he wept, quietly. So she wouldn't see, but she did. She walked to him, dripping, reached out, took his face in her hands and then whispered, You buried nothing. He blinked. What, you think you've buried your life? But it's still breathing. It just needed somewhere safe to wake up. He laughed through tears. Is that what this is, safe? She looked out over the hills, where birds now nested in the eaves, and nodded. Yes, for both of us. That night, they sat together on the porch. The storm passed. The stars returned. The wind chime swayed above them soft, slow, content, and the 10th bird slept on the wall, as if nothing had ever hurt it. Because sometimes unhealing means laying your wings down and letting the world move around you without having to fly anymore. In the morning, Samuel found her writing something on the inside of the cabin door. Just a word. Home. Some birds don't fly away because they're free. They stay because they've found somewhere worth landing. In the wild silence of the West, survival was never just about weathering the land. It was about weathering the ache of being unseen, buried not with shovels, but with silence. This story reminds us that healing doesn't come from running away. It comes when someone finally stays. When a man carries a broken girl not out of guilt, but out of recognition. When love doesn't demand names, or stories, or debts, just a place to sit and a wall to paint on. Sometimes the people we save are the ones who teach us to live again. To those who felt too far gone, too stained to be held, remember this. You don't need to fly to prove you've healed. You just need to rest without fear. And to those who've carried someone else's sorrow, know that your quiet presence may be the only reason they ever believe in light again. In a world that still hangs signs soaked in cruelty, be the porch. Be the chime that whispers, not screams. And when they finally carve, she lives here now into your life, you'll know you didn't just save her. You gave both of you a home.